So, are you somebody who has achieved a lot? Maybe you're a high achiever, an overachiever, um, somebody who, or even if you're not a high achiever or an overachiever, you've still done good things in your life. You've accomplished things. But have you ever gotten to a point where, even though you've just accomplished something great, that you felt like you were a fraud or an imposter? How could I get this recognition for this work? I didn't do that much, those sort of things. If you can relate to that experience, then you might be experiencing, or you might have experienced something called the imposter phenomenon. It's also called imposter syndrome, but for various reasons I will discuss today, we're going to call it imposter phenomenon. So I'm Dr. Kit Slies. I'm a life coach and licensed psychologist, and I'm here to inspire perfectionists and anxious achievers to feel calm and confident while holding clear boundaries. And so the original definition of, and it was, I believe, originally called imposter syndrome, even though it's not actually a syndrome, is the thing, um, is that it was originally just this um, feeling of phoniness, but has really expanded to mean that we feel that the feeling of being a fraud or phony in some way, despite really clear evidence of our success in this world. And so, why the heck is that? What does it all mean? Let's talk about that today, and let's talk about what to do about it. And the reality is that people in all parts of society and all levels of success experience imposter phenomenon. Even Michelle Obama was quoted as saying, I still have a little imposter syndrome. It doesn't go away. That feeling that you shouldn't take me seriously. What do I know? I should. I share that with you because we all have doubts in our abilities, about our power and what that power is. So I think it is helpful to look at people who we might look up to, or can at least acknowledge that they are successful and they still experience those imposter feelings. In fact, if you think about what imposter syndrome is, which is feeling that fraud feeling in spite of evidence as success, the reality is that actually, if you are more successful, you're almost more at risk of having those feelings, right? You are more at risk of feeling like a fraud. We can also see in people, though, just starting out in something new. But either way, the imposter feeling is a sign that you are being productive or achieving some level of success. Um, and while it's true that the imposter phenomenon can lead to concerning symptoms, it could lead to maybe some excessive worry. It could be correlated with anxiety, or if somebody is experiencing like actual mental health symptoms, it could interplay with that to be a real concern. But actually, there's research that exists that shows that imposter syndrome actually, the phenomenon, isn't something that is inherently bad. There's a professor, an assistant professor at MIT, who has done some research on this. Basima Tufik, I'm not sure how to pronounce their name, but they have researched this phenomenon and found that basically there's no real evidence in the research on it that imposter thoughts degrade our performance. And in fact, in their own research, they discovered that folks develop this other focused orientation in social interactions, and that actually makes them more interpersonally effective. So imposter syndrome can be a benefit if you think of it in that way, even though the experience of feeling like a fraud may feel uncomfortable. And this researcher has also found, they can cite other studies where there's actually benefits from having these imposter thoughts. For example, physicians doing better at attending to a really sensitive matter with a patient. Or another example would be folks who have these imposter thoughts as being perceived better on job interviews, as having better people skills. And again, it has to do with that other focus orientation. Because when you think about what the imposter thought is, it's like, oh, I'm a fraud in the eyes of these other people. And then we might engage in these kind of social management, perception management strategies to manage how we are being perceived by others. So it doesn't seem to degrade performance overall. Of course, it's an incredibly uncomfortable feeling, regardless. And there might be some exceptions where, again, if it's interacting with some mental health symptomology where it could be an actual issue. But the message I want you to take away from today is that just because you're having those feelings doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It's actually maybe a good sign that you have this other orientation and that you care about your own success and how others perceive that if success is something that's important to you. But there are also criticisms of even focusing on this notion of whether you call it a syndrome or a phenomenon, this notion of it. And the reason is because in the research, it seems that folks who experience these imposter thoughts or feelings more commonly are typically women and people of color. And so the criticism is that by saying that it's a syndrome or something that a person experiences, that we are putting the burden of responsibility for this individual for being that way, when in reality there could be actual systemic challenges that, of course, women and people of color face, particularly in the workplace. In other words, they don't feel like a phony because of some deficient quality in themselves, but rather because their environment reinforces that, hey, you are not as good uh, as other people in your environment. In other words, like it's not an internal fault that has no basis in reality, but there is a basis in reality for feeling that way, particularly for women and folks of color. And so the discourse on imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon has historically not really focused on that. But I will say in my own clinical work, I see men, privileged men, with pretty intense imposter syndrome, right? And or the imposter phenomenon thoughts. Um, and so here's the thing. We definitely want to take into consideration these environmental, real world factors. Um, Kevin Coakley has expanded on the definition of imposter phenomenon to include environmental factors for people of color. And this is his definition of the imposter phenomenon in this context for people of color. The definition is racialized imposter phenomenon as persistent beliefs or actions of intellectual and professional self-doubt among racially minoritized people due to experiences, systems, or principles of racial oppression and inequity. And so if you're thinking about imposter phenomenon and how to really work with it, one piece is to look at those racially oppressive systems or symptoms that reinforce gender inequity. Those systems, things that we actually need to do something about and actually change. But if imposter phenomenon is something that you are experiencing, even though you can say, hey, I realize it doesn't degrade my performance, hey, there's a benefit to it, but it's still like keeps coming up for you and doesn't feel great, you could still do some work with it on your own. And so one thing that you want to think about is like for you in particular, is there something that's being triggered for you? Think about how you feel when you feel like that fraud or those imposter thoughts. Ask yourself a few questions like, what is the worst case scenario about that situation that you're worried about? Are you worried about people judging you? Um, are you worried about not being able to achieve at some level? And then you want to ask yourself, if that worst case scenario were true, what would that mean about you as a person? Would it mean that you're not good enough to be successful? Would it mean that you're like not lovable in some way by your peers or not deserving of recognition? Would it mean that you um, does it mean that you don't actually want to be successful or that you are afraid in some way of the added responsibility of being successful? Maybe it's not about a fear of failure, right? So think about, what does it mean about you? What kind of questions or thoughts come up in those worst case scenarios? If you can identify what those sort of underlying concerns or beliefs about yourself are, then can begin to look for evidence that those things aren't true. So one activity that I do with a lot of my clients is we'll look at evidence of their success. Whether it's a fear of failure or a fear of success that's at the root for them, we can look for the evidence of their success. And so if it's a fear of failure, the evidence in and of itself is helpful to say, hey, um, and because even if you failed in your life, you have all these successes to look at. And if it's a fear of success, we can look at the evidence of the successes and say, look at all these successes that you took, that you achieved, and you're okay. You were able to manage them. And so I will ask folks to just keep track of successes. These can be big or small. They don't have to be astronomical. They could be like, I planned to do this thing today and I did it. Or it could be like, I won this award in third grade that felt really good. Okay, look over your whole life and just make a list and see how long you can make it. Have fun with it. Um, don't stop at one page. Keep going, just keep adding to it. And you have this like evidence that you can look to and say, wow, I am successful and I can manage it. If the things that come up for you is like, oh, I'm not good enough to be successful, or I'm not deserving of this love or recognition, um, we can start to challenge it by what you want to do is to say, actually, I am good enough because, or I deserve this recognition because, and you start to look for reasons to fill in the blank for that. Um, I I am good enough because I exist in this world. I am good enough for this activity because I actually have a lot of knowledge on it. I'm good enough to achieve this task because I've done something similar before and was successful on it. Um, I am deserving of love and recognition, and it's okay to receive that because I've received it before and I felt okay. I am deserving of recognition because I put a lot of hard work into this. I am deserving of recognition because this thing is important to me and the work that I do on it is going to have some impact. Okay. So that's sort of the two-step process for working with your imposter phenomenon. And to also remember that if you're feeling those feelings, it's probably not hurting your productivity. It might be helping you to have that other orientation. And it's also probably evidence that you are successful or productive in some way, shape, or form. So I hope that you found this helpful and that you are enjoying these videos in this series on high functioning anxiety, where a lot of folks with a high functioning anxiety are experiencing imposter phenomena. So until next time, take good care of yourselves. Bye.